Grace's hands trembled as she held the scalpel over the dying boy's abdomen. She was 16, untrained, and the entire town had branded her a fraud. "If you don't operate now, he'll die," Dr. Hayes said quietly. "Are you willing?" Through the kitchen door she could hear the mother's sobs. Mrs. Brennan had turned them away yesterday, saying the boy just needed prayer. Now the appendix was about to burst. Grace looked at the blade in her hand. One wrong cut, and she'd prove them all right. "Ready," she whispered. 6 months earlier, this girl was stealing apples just to survive. The Wyoming sun rose hard and unforgiving over the graves on the hill. Ethan Cole stood before the weathered cross, his shadow stretching long across the dry earth. 3 years, 3 winters of snow covering this ground, 3 summers of watching the grass grow tall around the marker that bore his wife's name. Margaret Ann Cole, beloved wife, 1847 to 1879. The words were simple, too simple for what she had been, for what he had lost. "Morning, Maggie," he said, his voice rough from disuse. In the silence of dawn, with no one but the wind to hear him, he allowed himself this one weakness. "Ranch is holding, just barely. Lost another 5 head last week to the drought. Jake thinks we might lose half the herd before fall if the rains don't come." He paused as if waiting for an answer that would never come. The wind moved through the cottonwoods down by the creek, carrying the scent of dust and dying grass. 3 years, and he still expected her to respond. To tell him it would be all right. To remind him that hard times passed and good men endured. But Margaret was gone. She had died trying to bring their child into this world, died in the middle of a January so cold the ground had refused to accept her body until spring thawed the earth. He had held her hand through 2 days of labor, watched the light fade from her eyes as the fever took her, and felt something inside himself die with her. The baby had died too. A boy. Ethan had buried him in his mother's arms, wrapped in the quilt Margaret had been stitching for months, the one covered with stars she said would guide him through dark nights. Now Ethan stood here every Sunday morning giving her reports like a soldier reporting to a commanding officer. It was habit, ritual, the only conversation he allowed himself anymore. "I'm managing," he said, though they both knew it was a lie. "Work keeps me busy. That's enough." He touched the cross once, his calloused fingers tracing the letters of her name, then turned and walked down the hill toward the ranch house. Behind him, the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning cool and promising, another day of brutal heat. The ranch spread out before him like a promise half kept. 800 acres of land that had once supported 400 head of cattle. Now there were barely 150 scattered across pastures where the grass grew thin and yellow. The barn needed repairs. The fences sagged in places. The house itself looked tired, as if it too mourned the woman who had made it a home. Ethan had built this place with his own hands, he and Margaret together. They had come west from Ohio with dreams bigger than the prairie sky, believing that hard work and love could carve out something lasting from the wilderness. For a while it had worked. The cattle had thrived. The land had been good to them. Margaret had filled the house with laughter and plans for the future. Then the fever came and the future died with her. Now the ranch was just work. Fence to mend, cattle to tend. Endless labor that filled the daylight hours and exhausted him enough to sleep through the nights without dreaming. Most nights, anyway. The nightmares came less frequently now than they had in the first year after her death. But they still came. Dreams of the war of battles fought 15 years ago in fields far from Wyoming. Dreams of blood and smoke and the faces of men he had killed. Dreams of Margaret calling his name from somewhere he could not reach. He had learned to live with ghosts. The sun stood a hand's width above the horizon when he reached the barn. The air already shimmered with heat. Another day in a summer that seemed determined to burn everything to ash. He picked up the tools he had left the evening before, wire and pliers, and a hammer, and headed out to the north fence line where a section had come down in last week's windstorm. The work was mindless. His hands knew what to do without thought. Stretch the wire, pull it taut, secure it to the post, move to the next section. His mind could wander while his body labored, and it wandered to dark places. To the question he asked himself every morning, why keep going? The ranch was failing. The drought had seen to that. Without rain, the grass died. Without grass, the cattle starved. Without cattle, there was no money, no future. Just the slow decline toward a day when he would have to sell everything and walk away from the land that held Margaret's grave. Maybe that would be a mercy. Maybe holding on was just another form of cowardice. He was tightening the wire on the third post when he heard hoofbeats. A single rider coming at an easy pace from the direction of the main road. Ethan straightened, shading his eyes against the glare. The rider resolved into a familiar shape Jacob Miller, the man everyone called Jake, the only ranch hand Ethan could still afford to pay. More than a ranch hand, really. Jake had been Ethan's friend since the war, since they had fought side by side in battles whose names Ethan tried hard to forget. They had both survived, though pieces of them had stayed behind on those blood-soaked fields. Jake had followed Ethan west, helped him build this ranch, stood beside him at Margaret's funeral when grief had nearly broken him. Jake was the only person Ethan still talked to with any regularity. The only one who understood the weight of old wars and new losses. The older man dismounted, his movements stiff. At 35, Jake looked older, his face weathered by sun and hard living. He had the lean, hard look of a man who had never known ease and eyes that had seen too much. "Morning," Jake said, pulling off his hat to wipe the sweat from his forehead. "Fence coming along." Slowly, Ethan picked up the wire again. "You're here early." "Couldn't sleep." Jake's tone was casual, but Ethan heard what lay beneath it. The nightmares again. "Figured I might as well make myself useful." They worked in silence for a while, the comfortable quiet of men who did not need words to understand each other. Jake held the wire while Ethan secured it. They moved down the fence line together, repairing the damage Storm and time had done. Finally, Jake spoke. "You still seeing them?" "The dreams." Ethan did not pretend to misunderstand. "Most nights." "Me too." Jake tested a post, found it loose, began digging around the base to reset it deeper. "Different battles, same dead faces. Does it ever stop?" "Don't know. Hasn't yet." Jake paused, then added, "But at least I've got whiskey to help me forget. You've just got work." "Work's enough." "Is it?" Jake's question hung in the air between them. "Because from where I'm standing, you're just surviving, Ethan. Not living. Just surviving." Ethan had no answer to that. He hammered the staple into the post harder than necessary. They finished the fence section as the sun climbed toward noon. The heat pressed down like a physical weight, drawing sweat and stealing breath. Ethan's shirt stuck to his back. His hands ached from gripping the tools. Good. Pain was a distraction. Pain was better than thinking. "Got to tell you something," Jake said as they gathered the tools. "Lost another 5 head last night. Found them this morning up in the north pasture. Died of thirst, looks like. Creek there's dried to nothing." Ethan closed his eyes. 5 more cattle. At this rate, they would be lucky to have 100 head by winter. "That puts us at 147. Jake's voice was grim. "If this drought doesn't break soon, Ethan, we're going to lose the ranch." There it was. The truth they had been dancing around for months. The ranch was dying as surely as Margaret had died, bleeding out slowly in a land that had turned hostile. "How long?" Ethan asked. 3 months. Maybe 4 if we're lucky and the rains come." Jake met his eyes. "But if we have to buy feed to keep the remaining cattle alive through winter, we won't make it to spring. You'll have to sell, probably to Dalton. He's been waiting for this." Frank Dalton, the neighboring rancher who had been circling like a vulture making offers to buy the land at prices that were just short of insulting. Dalton wanted the water rights, wanted to add Ethan's 800 acres to his own empire. He would let Ethan keep the small plot on the hill where Margaret was buried, he had said, as if that was charity instead of cruelty. "I'm not selling," Ethan said. "Then what are you going to do?" "Keep working, keep fighting, same as always." Jake studied him for a long moment. "You know, sometimes holding on is just another way of giving up. Sometimes you have to let go to survive." "I'm not letting go of this land." Ethan's voice was hard. "Margaret's buried here. This is where we built our life. I'm not walking away from that. Even if staying means you go down with it. Even then." Jake shook his head but did not argue further. They had had this conversation before. They would have it again. But in the end, Ethan knew Jake would stand with him even if it meant going down together. They headed back toward the house, leading their horses through grass that crunched dry beneath their boots. The landscape stretched out in every direction, brown and gold and waiting for rain that might never come, beautiful and brutal in equal measure. This was the West, a place that gave with one hand and took with the other, that promised everything and guaranteed nothing. Ethan had learned that lesson too many times. They were halfway to the barn when Ethan heard it. A sound that did not belong. Small, faint, coming from the direction of the house. He stopped, hand going automatically to the pistol at his hip. Years of war had taught him to notice things out of place, sounds that did not fit the normal rhythm of the day. "You hear that?" Jake's voice was low. "Yeah." Ethan tilted his head, listening. There it was again. A scrape maybe, or a footfall, coming from near the house, from the root cellar if he was not mistaken. They exchanged a look. It would not be the first time some drifter had helped themselves to Ethan's supplies. Last spring, a pair of cowboys passing through had decided his smokehouse was fair game. Before that, a family of settlers had camped in his barn without asking, taking half a bag of oats when they moved on. The West was full of people desperate enough to steal. Ethan understood desperation, but understanding did not mean acceptance. "Could be a coyote," Jake offered, but his hand had moved to his own weapon. "Coyotes don't open root cellar doors." They approached the house, carefully splitting up to come at it from two angles. The root cellar sat against the side of the building doors, angled into the earth, one standing slightly ajar. Ethan had been certain he had closed them the night before. He always closed them. Someone had been inside. Ethan moved to the barn first, retrieving his Winchester from where it leaned against the wall. He checked the chamber. Loaded. Good. He did not want to shoot anyone, but he would not be stolen from either. There were rules out here, even in the wilderness, lines that should not be crossed. Jake positioned himself to the side, his pistol drawn. They had done this before, cleared buildings in the war when enemy soldiers might be waiting behind any door. The movements came back like muscle memory. Silent signals, careful approach. Ethan pulled the cellar door open wide, letting sunlight flood down the wooden steps. Shadows scattered, shapes resolved into barrels and crates and hanging bundles of dried herbs. And a girl. She stood at the bottom of the stairs, small and thin, and holding a half-eaten apple in one hand. Her feet were bare and filthy, her dark hair falling in tangled masses around her shoulders. Her dress was so faded its original color was impossible to guess, torn in places and stained with dirt and something darker. Blood, maybe. Old blood. But it was her eyes that caught him. Gray-blue, the color of creek water in winter, staring up at him without fear or tears. Just a flat, exhausted emptiness that made something twist uncomfortably in Ethan's chest. She looked like a ghost, like something already dead just waiting for her body to realize it. "Come on out," Ethan said, keeping the rifle steady but not threatening. "Slow." The girl did not move for a long moment. Then, with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to expect violence, she climbed the stairs. Each step seemed to cost her effort, as if her legs barely had the strength to carry her weight. She emerged into the sunlight, and Ethan got his first good look at her. 16, he guessed, though exhaustion and dirt made it hard to tell for certain. It was hard to tell with the dirt and exhaustion. Her skin was pale beneath the grime, her lips cracked from thirst. Her hands were thin and scratched, nails broken and rimmed with dirt. She had been walking for a while, days at least. Jake moved closer, holstering his pistol. "Easy now, we're not going to hurt you." The girl's eyes flicked to Jake, then back to Ethan and the rifle. She took another bite of the apple, chewing mechanically, as if she had already made peace with whatever was about to happen. "Your parents," Ethan heard himself say, his voice rougher than he intended. "Where are they?" The girl swallowed. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear. "They died this morning. I only wanted an apple." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. Not the content, but the delivery. The flat matter-of-fact tone. No tears, no trembling. Just stating a truth as simple and terrible as the sky being blue. This girl had seen death recently, had touched it, had buried it probably with her own hands, and something inside her had broken in a way that left her beyond tears. Ethan had seen that look before, in the mirror in the months after Margaret died, in Jake's eyes when he woke from the nightmares, in the faces of soldiers after battles that took everything they had. This was what grief looked like when it went beyond feeling. "Cholera," the girl continued when neither man spoke. "They got sick 3 days ago. This morning they stopped breathing. I buried them as best I could, by the creek 2 miles east. Then I started walking, saw your place from the ridge. The cellar door was open." She paused, looking down at the apple in her hand, half eaten, as if she had been interrupted in the middle of a meal. "I was going to leave before you noticed," she added. "I'm sorry." Ethan lowered the rifle. His mind was racing, trying to process what he was hearing. Cholera, parents dead, this girl alone and desperate, walking until she found a place to steal food. How long since she had eaten? How long since she had water? "When did you last drink?" he asked. "Yesterday evening, at the creek. Yesterday evening, and she was still walking today. Still moving." Jake swore softly. Ethan made a decision. Later he would wonder why. What made him lower the gun and step aside instead of sending her on her way? Maybe it was the memory of Margaret, who never turned anyone away from their door. Maybe it was his own guilt, the knowledge that he had failed to save his wife, but could perhaps save this stranger. Maybe it was the war, the memory of a young girl he had shot by mistake, thinking she was a soldier, her face haunting his dreams for years. Or maybe it was just exhaustion. Exhaustion with death and loss and the cruelty of a world that took parents from children and left them to starve. "Inside," he said. "Now." The girl's eyes widened slightly, the first real expression he had seen on her face. "Sir, you need water, food, and you need to get out of this sun before you collapse." He gestured toward the house. "Move." She stared at him for a long moment as if checking for a trap. Then slowly she nodded and walked toward the door. Her gait was unsteady, each step careful. Ethan noticed she favored her right foot, injured probably, or just worn raw from walking without shoes. Jake caught his arm as they followed her. "You sure about this?" "No." Ethan watched the girl disappear into the house. "But I'm doing it anyway." Inside the house was dark and cool after the brutal sun. Ethan pointed the girl toward the table, the heavy oak piece that Margaret had insisted they bring from Ohio. It was one of the few things in the house that still carried her presence. The girl sat carefully, as if afraid the chair might collapse under her. She folded her hands in her lap, the apple still clutched in one thin fist. Ethan moved to the pump, working the handle until water gushed into a tin cup. He set it in front of her. She picked it up with both hands and drank without stopping, water spilling from the corners of her mouth. When she finished, she set the cup down and drew a shaking breath. He refilled it. She drank again, and again. 3 cups before she finally stopped, her hands trembling. "Slowly," Ethan said. "You make yourself sick. It defeats the purpose." "Yes, sir." He ladled beans into a bowl, cut a thick slice of cornbread, and put both in front of her. The girl looked at the food as if it might vanish if she blinked. Then she picked up the spoon and began eating with careful, deliberate bites. The kind of eating that said she had gone hungry before and knew better than to rush. Ethan sat down across from her, his own appetite forgotten. He should be eating too. He had been working since before dawn. But watching this girl consume beans and cornbread with the focused intensity of someone who did not know when the next meal might come made his own hunger seem trivial. "Got a name?" he asked. She swallowed before answering. "Grace. Grace Bennett." "Ethan Cole. That's Jake Miller." He nodded toward where Jake stood by the door watching. "This is my ranch." "I know. I heard people in town mention your name when we passed through last week." That surprised him. "What did they say?" Grace's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. "That you kept to yourself. That your wife died and you didn't want company anymore." Accurate enough. He wondered what else she had heard. Probably that he was difficult, unfriendly, a man best left alone. "They tell you anything else? That you were fair but hard, that you didn't suffer fools or trespassers?" She met his eyes then, and for the first time he saw something other than exhaustion. Maybe defiance, maybe just honesty. "I'm sorry I trespassed. I thought you wouldn't notice one apple. I thought I'd be gone before dawn." "Where were you planning to go?" The flicker died. "I don't know. Just away." Ethan leaned back in his chair studying her. 16, maybe younger, orphaned, no family that she had mentioned, barefoot and half-starved. The smart thing would be to feed her, give her some supplies, send her into town. Redemption Springs had a church people who took pride in their charity work. They would find a place for her. But even as he thought it, Ethan knew what would happen. A girl with no family, no prospects, no protection. She would be passed around like an unwanted burden working for her keep until she was old enough to marry whatever man was desperate or cruel enough to take a penniless orphan as a wife. He had seen it before. The West was full of girls like that, ground down by circumstance until they disappeared entirely. "You got any kin?" he asked. "Anywhere." Grace shook her head. "It was just the three of us. My father had a brother in Missouri, but they haven't spoken in 10 years. I don't even know if he's alive." "What about your mother's people?" "Dead. Fever took them during the war." Ethan rubbed his jaw, feeling the rasp of stubble under his palm. The smart thing, the safe thing, the thing that would let him return to his carefully constructed solitude. But when he looked at Grace, he did not see a burden. He saw Margaret, who would have taken this girl in without a second thought. He saw the young woman he had killed in the war, the one whose face still haunted him. He saw himself alone and desperate, clinging to a ranch that was slowly dying. "You know anything about ranch work?" he heard himself ask. Grace's eyes widened. "Sir, chickens, garden, cooking, mending. You know how to do any of that?" "Yes, sir. My mother taught me. We had a small place in Nebraska before things went bad." Ethan nodded slowly, already regretting the words forming in his mind. "I could use someone around here, just temporarily," he added quickly, "until you figure out what you want to do. There's a room off the kitchen. Storage mostly, but it's got a window and a cot. You work for your keep, stay out of trouble. And when you're ready to move on, I'll stake you some supplies and point you in whatever direction you choose." The girl stared at him as if he had just spoken in a language she did not understand. "You're offering me work, a place to stay, temporarily," Ethan repeated harder this time. "I'm not looking for permanent company. But you're young, and you've got no one. Turning you out right now would be the same as signing your death warrant. I won't have that on my conscience." Grace set down her spoon with shaking hands. For the first time since he had found her in the cellar, her eyes filled with something that was not quite tears, but close. "Why?" The question was so quiet he almost missed it. "Why what? Why would you help me?" "You don't know me. I trespassed on your property. You could have shot me and been within your rights." Ethan looked away toward the window where dust motes danced in the afternoon light. "Because I know what it's like to be alone," he thought. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything. Because Margaret would have taken you in without hesitation. Because maybe doing this is the last decent thing I have left in me." But he did not say any of that. Instead, he stood up and carried his plate to the sink. "Finish your food, then I'll show you the room. We start work at dawn." Grace finished the beans in silence, scraping the bowl clean. She followed Ethan through the house like a ghost, her footsteps barely audible. The room he showed her was small, barely bigger than a closet, but it had a narrow cot with a faded quilt, a wash basin on a rough wooden table, and a single window that looked out toward the barn. After weeks of sleeping on the ground under a wagon canvas, it looked like a palace. "There's water in the pump out back," Ethan said from the doorway. "Soap's in the cabinet. You'll want to clean up before supper." "Supper?" Grace turned to look at him. "I thought the beans were supper." "That was lunch, such as it was. I'll make something more substantial tonight." He paused, shifting his weight. "You'll need shoes. I'll see what I can find." "Mr. Cole, Ethan," he interrupted. "If you're staying even temporarily, we don't need to stand on ceremony." "Ethan," she repeated softly, testing the name. "Thank you. I'll work hard." "I promise you won't regret this." He grunted, already turning away. "We'll see. Get cleaned up." As he walked back to the kitchen, he heard Jake's low whistle. "You sure you know what you're doing?" "No." "Town's going to talk." "Let them." "I'm serious, Ethan. A girl her age living here with you, people will assume things." "Then people can go to hell." Ethan pulled open a cupboard, staring at its contents without really seeing them. "She needed help. I gave it. That's all there is to it." "Is it?" Jake's tone was careful. "Or is this about something else, about Margaret?" Ethan's hand clenched on the cupboard door. "Don't." "I'm just saying, maybe you're trying to save this girl because you couldn't save your wife, but that's not going to bring Margaret back. Nothing will." "I know that." The words came out harsh. Ethan forced himself to breathe. "I know she's not coming back, Jake, but I can still help someone who needs it. Is that so wrong?" Jake was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "No, it's not wrong. Just don't expect it to be easy. This town's got long memories and sharp tongues. Once they find out Grace is here, there will be talk. Bad talk. Let them talk." But even as he said it, Ethan wondered if he had just made a terrible mistake. By the time the sun began its slow descent toward the mountains, Grace had washed away 3 days of road dust and changed into a clean dress Ethan had found in a trunk. One of Margaret's old ones. Faded blue calico that was too big in some places and too small in others, but infinitely better than the rags she had been wearing. Her hair hung in a damp braid down her back, and her feet were wrapped in clean cloth until Ethan could find proper shoes. She emerged from her room to find him standing at the stove stirring something in a cast-iron pot. The kitchen smelled of salt pork and onions, and her stomach growled despite the beans she had eaten earlier. "Sit," Ethan said without turning around. "This will be ready in a minute." Grace sat at the table, hands folded in her lap, watching him move around the kitchen with the efficiency of long practice. He was not a large man, but he carried himself with a solid presence that made him seem bigger. At 38, his hair was already touched with gray at the temples, and his face was weathered by hard years under the unforgiving sun. There was a scar along his jaw, she noticed, old and faded, but visible. A war wound, probably. He set a bowl in front of her, stew thick with potatoes and chunks of pork. He took his own seat across the table. They ate in silence. The only sound was the scrape of spoons against pottery and the distant call of crows settling in for the night. Finally, Ethan spoke. "Tomorrow I'll show you around the place. Chickens are your responsibility now. Feeding, collecting eggs. There's a garden plot behind the house that's gone to weeds. You fix that. Anything you grow is yours to use for cooking. I'll teach you the rest as we go." Grace nodded. "I won't let you down." "See that you don't." He paused, spoon halfway to his mouth. "Town's going to talk when they find out you're here." "I know. They'll assume things. About you. About me." "I know that, too." Ethan set down his spoon. "I don't care what they think. But you need to understand life out here is hard enough without carrying other people's judgments. You sure you want to take this on?" Grace met his eyes across the table, and in hers he saw something he recognized. The stubborn will of someone who had already lost everything and had nothing left to fear. "I'm sure," she said. The first week passed in a blur of work and silence. Grace moved through the ranch like a shadow, doing what was asked and then finding more to do without being told. She fed the chickens at dawn, weeded the garden until her hands blistered scrubbed floors that had not seen soap in months. She cooked simple meals, beans and cornbread and stew, and ate quietly across from Ethan while evening light faded through the windows. They spoke little. Ethan was not a man given to conversation, and Grace seemed content with silence. But in the spaces between words, a rhythm began to form. He left boots by her door too big, but better than cloth wrappings. She left his shirts mended buttons, replaced tears sewn shut with careful stitches. Neither acknowledged these small exchanges, but they accumulated anyway, building something fragile and unspoken. On the 8th day, Ethan needed supplies from town. He saddled his horse and looked at Grace, who was scattering corn for the chickens. "You want to come into Redemption Springs?" he asked. She went very still, her hand frozen in the feed bucket. "No, sir. I'll stay here." "You can't hide forever." "I'm not hiding. I just prefer not to." Ethan studied her face, seeing the fear she was trying to bury. "All right. I'll be back before dark. You need anything?" "No, sir. Thank you." He rode out, and Grace watched until he disappeared over the ridge. Then she went back to work, moving faster now, as if she could outrun the dread building in her chest. Ethan returned as the sun touched the horizon, saddlebags heavy with flour, sugar, coffee, and other necessities. He also brought back a pair of women's boots he had gotten from the general store, second-hand but sturdy, and a length of fabric that might make a decent dress if someone knew how to sew. Grace was in the garden when he arrived, hands dark with soil, her face flushed from the heat. She had made progress. The weeds were mostly gone, and neat rows marked where she had planted seeds. Tomatoes, beans, squash. Things that would grow fast in the brutal summer heat if they got enough water. "Got you something?" Ethan said, dismounting. He pulled the boots from the saddlebag. "Try these." Grace wiped her hands on her dress and took the boots carefully as if they might break. She sat down right there in the dirt and pulled them on. They fit well enough, a little loose, but nothing an extra pair of socks would not fix. "They're perfect," she said softly. "How much do I owe you?" "Nothing. Consider it part of your wages." "Wages." She looked up at him, confused. Ethan shifted, uncomfortable. "You work, you get paid. That's how it works." "But I'm working for room and board. That's what we agreed." "Well, I'm changing the agreement. $1 a week plus room and board. You've earned it." Grace stared at the boots on her feet, and Ethan saw her throat work as she swallowed hard. "Thank you," she whispered. He grunted and turned away, leading his horse toward the barn. Behind him, he heard her voice, still quiet but stronger now. "Ethan." He looked back. "People in town. Did they ask about me?" His jaw tightened. "Some." "What did you tell them?" "That it wasn't their business." The faintest hint of a smile touched her lips. "I imagine that went over well." "About as well as you'd expect." He paused. "Mrs. Brennan from the church said if you needed womanly counsel or Christian charity, her door was always open." The smile died. "That's kind of her." "That's nosy of her is what it is." Ethan pulled the saddle from his horse. "You don't owe anyone explanations, Grace. Not her, not anyone. You remember that?" "Yes, sir." "And stop calling me sir. Makes me feel like a general." This time the smile came back. "Yes, Ethan." 2 weeks became 3. The garden began to show green shoots pushing through the soil. The chickens started laying more regularly under Grace's care. The house lost some of its dusty neglect. Rooms that had been closed for years now opened to light and air. And slowly, carefully, Grace began to speak. It started small, a comment about the weather, a question about how he liked his coffee, then gradually more. She told him about Nebraska, about the farm her parents had tried to make work before drought and debt forced them west. She told him about her mother's herb garden, how she had learned which plants could heal and which could harm. She told him about the books her father had taught her to read from the stories that had filled their evenings before sickness came. Ethan listened more than he spoke. But when he did talk, he found himself sharing things he had not said aloud in years. About Margaret, about how they had met in Ohio when he was just a ranch hand with big dreams. About the journey west, the hard winters, the good years when the grass grew tall and the cattle thrived. About the morning he had found her fevered and delirious, and the 2 weeks he had watched her fade despite everything he tried. "You blame yourself," Grace said one evening. They were sitting on the porch watching the last light drain from the sky. "Wouldn't you—" Ethan did not look at her. "I don't know. Maybe." She was quiet for a moment. "I blamed myself when my parents died. Thought maybe if I'd known more about healing, if I'd done something different. It was cholera. There wasn't anything you could have done. I know that now, but knowing doesn't always help, does it?" Ethan looked at her then, this girl who had walked out of his cellar with dirt on her hands and death in her eyes, and he saw someone who understood grief in a way most people never would, someone who carried loss the way he did, like a weight that never lightened but only became more familiar. "No," he said quietly, "it doesn't." They sat in silence as stars began to prick the darkening sky, and somewhere in that silence the careful distance they had maintained began to shift, not disappearing. Neither of them was ready for that, but changing into something less like wariness and more like recognition. Two people who had lost everything finding something like companionship in the space between words. On the 23rd day, trouble came. Ethan was checking fence line on the north pasture when he saw the riders coming. 7 men on horseback moving at an easy pace across his land. He did not recognize them at first, but as they drew closer, he placed most of them. Frank Dalton, the neighboring rancher, 3 of Dalton's hands, Pastor David Bennett from the church, Sheriff Tom Morgan, and bringing up the rear looking incongruous on horseback Mrs. Brennan. Ethan's jaw tightened. This was not a social call. He walked to meet them, hand resting on the pistol at his hip. Not threatening, just present. "Cole," Dalton called out, reining in his horse. He was a big man, red-faced and prosperous, the kind who thought money gave him the right to speak for everyone. "We need to talk." "So talk." Dalton glanced at the others, then back at Ethan. "It's about the girl. Grace has a name. Use it." "Fine. It's about Grace Bennett. Word around town is she's living here with you, unchaperoned. That true?" "She works here. I pay her wages and provide room and board. It's a business arrangement." "Business arrangement." Dalton's laugh was ugly. "That what we're calling it now?" Ethan's hand moved slightly on his pistol. "Say what you came to say, Dalton, then get off my land." Pastor Bennett spoke up, his voice gentler but no less insistent. "Mr. Cole, we understand you meant well taking the girl in, but the situation is irregular. It's causing talk, concern. People worry about her welfare, about what this looks like to others. People can worry all they want. Doesn't change the facts." "The fact is," Dalton cut in, "you've got a teenage girl living in your house without any proper supervision or protection. Now we're willing to be reasonable about this. Mrs. Brennan has offered to take the girl into her household, give her proper Christian guidance and training. You can send her wages if you want to keep things charitable, but she can't stay here." "No," Ethan said flatly. "No." Dalton's face darkened. "You don't get to just say no, Cole," one of the ranch hands added. "We're trying to do right by this girl. You're trying to control her. There's a difference." Mrs. Brennan urged her horse forward. She was a thin woman in her 50s with iron gray hair pulled tight and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. "Mr. Cole, surely you understand how this appears. A young woman alone with a bachelor. It's improper. It invites scandal. The only scandal here is you people riding onto my land to tell me what I can and can't do with my own property and my own money. If the girl's welfare is at stake," Sheriff Morgan began, but Ethan cut him off. "She's fed, clothed, paid, and safe. What more do you want?" "We want her in a proper Christian home." Mrs. Brennan snapped, the pretense of sweetness finally dropping. "This territory may be rough, but we're not savages. We don't allow just anyone to claim authority over a vulnerable child. That girl is more capable than most adults I know. She works harder in a day than half this town works in a week. She's respectful, honest, and decent. Whatever poison you're spreading about her says more about you than it does about her." Before anyone could respond, a voice cut through the tension. "I'm not living in sin." Everyone turned. Grace stood on the porch, hands clenched at her sides, face pale but determined. Ethan wanted to tell her to go inside to let him handle this, but something in her posture stopped him. She had a right to speak, a right to defend herself. "Miss Bennet," Pastor Bennet said carefully, "we know this must be difficult. You don't know anything about me." Grace's voice was stronger now. "You don't know what I've been through, what I've lost. Mr. Cole took me in when I had nothing. He gave me work wages and respect. He's never touched me inappropriately or treated me with anything but decency. Whatever you're implying is a lie." "We're not implying anything," Dalton said. "We're stating facts. A young girl alone with a man." "I'm not alone. I'm employed. There's a difference." Grace descended the porch steps, moving closer. "And if you're so concerned about my welfare, where were you when my parents died? Where was your Christian charity? Then I walked miles barefoot looking for help. Not one of you offered so much as a cup of water." Dalton's face reddened. "Now see here." "No, you see here." Grace's hands were shaking, but her voice held steady. "I know what you really want. You want me quiet and grateful, working for some family for nothing but room and board until I'm old enough to marry whoever's desperate enough to take a penniless orphan. You want me to disappear into your idea of respectability. Well, I won't do it. I'd rather die than live like that." "Grace," Ethan said quietly, "that's enough." She looked at him, and he saw tears in her eyes, but also fire. "No, it's not enough. These people need to understand. I'm staying here because it's my choice. Because Mr. Cole treats me like a person, not property. Because for the first time since my parents died, I feel like I have a future. And if that offends their delicate sensibilities, that's their problem, not mine." Pastor Bennet cleared his throat. "Miss Bennet, we're only trying to help." "Then leave me alone," Grace said flatly. "That would help more than anything else you could do." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Dalton wheeled his horse around, jerking the reins hard enough to make the animal toss its head. "You're making a mistake, Cole, both of you. This town won't forget this." "Good," Ethan said. "Neither will I." The riders left in a cloud of dust and anger. As they disappeared over the ridge, Ethan turned to Grace. She stood in the yard, arms wrapped around herself, shaking so hard her teeth chattered. "That was foolish," he said. "I know. Brave but foolish. I know that too." She looked up at him, tears finally spilling over. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have spoken like that. I just couldn't let them talk about you that way, couldn't let them make something decent and kind into something ugly." Ethan walked over to her and after a moment's hesitation put a hand on her shoulder. She flinched, then relaxed into the touch. "You don't have anything to apologize for," he said. "You stood your ground. That takes courage." Courage or stupidity. Sometimes there's not much difference. He squeezed her shoulder once, then let go. "Come on, work to be done." They spent the rest of the day in their usual routines. Ethan mending fence, Grace tending the garden and chickens. But something had shifted. The comfortable silence they had built felt different now, charged with an awareness they had both been trying to ignore. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set, Grace finally spoke. "They're going to make trouble, aren't they?" "Probably." "What kind of trouble?" Ethan was quiet for a moment, considering. "Dalton's got influence. He could convince other ranchers not to do business with me. Mrs. Brennan could turn the church women against me, which means their husbands won't buy my cattle or sell me supplies. Could make things difficult. Then I should leave before it gets worse." "No." The word came out harder than he intended. "That's what they want. To run you off. Prove they were right. I won't give them the satisfaction. But if they hurt you because of me, then that's my choice to make." He looked at her in the fading light. "You asked me once why I helped you. Truth is, I've been half dead for 3 years, just going through the motions. Then you showed up, and for the first time since Margaret died, I felt like maybe there was still something worth protecting in this world. So no, you're not leaving. Not because of them." Grace's eyes filled with tears again, but this time she did not look away. "I don't understand you, Ethan Cole. You barely know me. Why would you risk everything for someone like me?" "Because someone like you deserves better than what this world's tried to give you," he said simply, "and because I'm tired of letting fear make my decisions." They sat in silence as darkness fell and stars began to emerge. Somewhere in the distance a coyote called, lonely and wild. Grace pulled her shawl tighter against the evening chill. What happens now? Now we keep going. We work the ranch, tend the garden, live our lives, and we don't give them the satisfaction of seeing us break. And if they don't give up? Ethan stood stretching muscles sore from a day's work. Then we deal with whatever comes, together. He went inside, leaving Grace on the porch with the night settling around her like a blanket. She sat there for a long time looking at the stars, thinking about choices and courage and the strange path that had led her from a grave by a creek to this porch, this moment, this man who had chosen to stand beside her when the whole world seemed arrayed against them. Finally, she rose and went inside. Through the kitchen window, she could see Ethan at the table going over accounts by lamplight. His face was weathered and tired, but there was something solid about him, something immovable. She thought about her parents, about the life they had tried to build before sickness took them. They had taught her to stand tall, to work hard, to never accept less than she deserved. Looking at Ethan now, she realized this strange arrangement, this temporary refuge that was becoming something more, was exactly what they would have wanted for her. Not charity, not rescue, but partnership, respect, a chance to prove her own worth. The future stretched out before them, uncertain and challenging. But as Grace stood in that doorway watching the man who had given her a second chance, she felt something she had not felt since the morning her parents died. Hope. The gifts began arriving on the 25th day. Not grand gestures, not expensive offerings, just small tokens left at the edge of the property where the main road met Ethan's land. A jar of honey wrapped in cloth, no note attached. A basket of eggs nestled in straw, a small crock of preserved peaches, the kind that took hours of work over a hot stove. Grace found them in the mornings when she went to feed the chickens. She would bring them to Ethan, confusion written on her face, and he would examine them in silence before carrying them inside. "Who's leaving these?" she asked on the third morning, holding a bundle of dried herbs tied with twine. "People who don't want to be seen helping us." Ethan studied the herbs, yarrow, chamomile, sage. Someone knew Grace was a healer. Peterson family, probably. They lost 2 children to scarlet fever 5 years back. Widow Mallister for the eggs. The peaches might be from Maria Rodriguez, the Mexican woman who lives on the edge of town. Why don't they just come to the door? Because being seen supporting us would cost them. Mrs. Brennan would make sure of it. He handed the herbs back to Grace. "Take these. Add them to your collection." Grace's herb garden had grown in the weeks since she had arrived. The small plot behind the house now held neat rows of medicinal plants, each carefully tended. Willow bark for pain and fever, chamomile for sleep and digestion, yarrow to stop bleeding, sage for infections. Her mother had taught her well, and she remembered every lesson. Ethan had watched her work with the plants, seen the careful attention she gave to each one. This was more than gardening. This was preparation. Grace was building an apothecary without realizing it, gathering the tools she would need to help people. And people were starting to notice. On the 28th day, a ranch hand from a neighboring property showed up at dawn, his arm wrapped in a blood-soaked rag. His name was Tom, and he worked for a man named Richards who owned land to the south. "Caught it on barbed wire," Tom said, his face pale. "It's deep. Was going to ride to town for the doctor, but Richard said maybe the girl here could look at it first. Said it'd be cheaper." Grace unwrapped the rag carefully. The cut ran from Tom's wrist to his elbow, deep enough to expose muscle. Blood welled up immediately, flowing in steady pulses that meant an artery was involved. "Inside," she said, her voice calm. "Now." Ethan watched from the doorway as Grace worked. She cleaned the wound with water she had boiled and saved in a covered pot, her movements quick and efficient. She packed it with yarrow to slow the bleeding, then used needle and thread to close the deepest parts. Her hands never shook. Her face remained focused, intent. Tom gritted his teeth through the pain, sweat rolling down his face, but he never pulled away. He trusted her completely, this girl he had never met before. When she finished, Grace wrapped the arm in clean cloth and gave Tom a small pouch of willow bark. "Steep this in hot water. Drink it 3 times a day for the pain. Come back in a week so I can check for infection. If the wound gets red or hot or starts to smell bad, come back immediately. Understand?" "Yes, ma'am." Tom stood testing his arm carefully. "How much do I owe you?" "Nothing." Grace wiped her hands on her apron. "Just take care of it." Tom reached into his pocket anyway, pulled out a silver dollar and set it on the table. "For your trouble." Then he was gone before Grace could protest. She picked up the coin, turning it over in her fingers. "I didn't do it for money." "I know," Ethan said, "but people out here understand that nothing comes free. They need to pay, even if it's small. Otherwise, they feel like they're taking charity, and charity makes people uncomfortable. My mother never charged. Your mother probably had a husband who provided for her. You don't." He nodded toward the coin. "Take it. You earned it." Grace closed her fingers around the dollar, and Ethan saw something shift in her expression. Recognition, maybe, of her own worth, of what her skills could provide. She was becoming more than a hired hand. She was becoming necessary. The realization should have worried him, should have made him pull back, remind her that this arrangement was temporary. But instead, he felt something close to pride. This girl he had found stealing apples was turning into someone remarkable, and the community was starting to see it too. By the end of the 4th week, 3 more people had come seeking Grace's help. A child with a persistent cough, an old woman with arthritis in her hands, a pregnant woman worried about swelling in her ankles. Grace treated them all, asking nothing in return, but they left gifts anyway. Bread, vegetables, a chicken. The ranch that had felt empty and dying was starting to pulse with life again. But with that life came danger. Jake noticed it first. He arrived one morning with fresh coffee and a worried expression. "You know people are talking, right?" Ethan was replacing boards on the porch. "People are always talking. Not like this." Jake dismounted, tying his horse to the rail. "They're saying Grace is practicing medicine, that she's taking patients away from Dr. Hayes. Mrs. Brennan is telling everyone she's dangerous, that it's only a matter of time before someone gets hurt." "Has anyone gotten hurt?" "No. In fact, Tom's arm is healing better than expected. But that doesn't matter to Mrs. Brennan. She's building a case against Grace, and by extension against you." Ethan hammered a nail harder than necessary. "Let her build whatever she wants. We're not doing anything wrong." "Wrong doesn't matter if enough people believe it does." Jake leaned against the rail, his face serious. "I'm worried, Ethan, about what's coming, because something is coming. I can feel it." Ethan wanted to argue, but he felt it too. The pressure building like thunderclouds on the horizon. The sense that the fragile peace they had built was about to break. He just did not know how or when. The answer came 2 days later, carried on winds that smelled of rain and violence. Ethan woke before dawn to a sky that had turned the color of old bruises. The air felt thick, heavy with moisture that pressed down like a physical weight. The cattle in the north pasture were restless, their lowing carrying across the dry grass in waves of anxiety. Storm coming. A big one. He found Grace already awake, standing on the porch and staring at the horizon. Lightning flickered in the distance, too far away for thunder, but close enough to worry about. "How bad?" she asked without turning. "Bad enough." Ethan studied the clouds. They were moving fast, rolling across the prairie like a dark army. "We need to secure everything. Cattle, horses, chickens. Get them all under cover." "What can I do?" He looked at her. The smart thing would be to send her inside, keep her safe. But they did not have time for smart. They needed every hand available. "Chickens first. Get them into the coop and bar the door. Then help Jake with the horses. I'll go after the cattle." Grace nodded and was gone before he could say more, running toward the chicken coop with her skirts hiked up to her knees. Ethan watched her for just a moment, then headed for the barn to saddle his horse. The storm hit an hour later with the force of something alive and angry. The wind came first, screaming across the prairie and tearing at anything not nailed down. It ripped shingles from the barn roof, sent tools flying, turned dust into blinding clouds that stung exposed skin like thrown sand. Ethan had to lean into it just to walk each step a battle against invisible hands trying to push him back. Then the rain. Not a gradual increase, but a deluge, as if the sky had opened and decided to empty itself all at once. Within seconds, Ethan was soaked through. Water ran into his eyes, making it almost impossible to see. The ground turned to mud beneath his horse's hooves. And the lightning. Brilliant white cracks that split the darkness, turning the world stark and colorless for half a second before plunging it back into shadow. Thunder followed so loud it seemed to shake the earth itself. Ethan found the cattle in the north pasture bunched together and starting to panic. He could see it in their movements, the way they pressed against each other and began to shift as a group. In another minute, they would bolt. And once a herd started running in a storm, there was no stopping them until they scattered across miles of prairie or ran themselves into fences and broke their legs. He whistled, the sound sharp and piercing even through the wind. His horse responded immediately, moving to circle the cattle from the left. But one man could not control a frightened herd alone. Then he saw another rider coming from the direction of the house, smaller, lighter in the saddle. Grace. She should not be here, should not be risking herself like this, but there was no time to send her back. "Left side," he shouted, though he doubted she could hear him over the storm. But she seemed to understand anyway, moving her horse to push the cattle from the opposite direction. Together they worked the herd. It was brutal, exhausting labor. The horses slipped in the mud. The rain made it impossible to see more than a few yards ahead. Lightning struck close enough that Ethan felt the hair on his arms stand up, tasted metal on his tongue. But slowly, painfully, they got the cattle moving in the right direction, toward the shelter of the trees along the creek, toward safety. One of the cows broke away from the group. Pregnant, heavy with calf, she ran toward a section of fence that had already started to collapse. If she hit it, she would injure herself and probably lose the calf. Ethan was too far away, could not reach her in time. But Grace was closer. She did not hesitate, just spurred her horse forward, pulling a lasso from her saddle as she rode. The rope sailed through the rain, settling around the cow's neck with practiced ease. The cow fought, pulling hard. For a terrible moment, Ethan thought Grace would be dragged from the saddle. But she wrapped the rope around her saddle horn and used her horse's weight to slow the animal turn, bring it back toward the herd. Her face was set with concentration, rain streaming down her cheeks. She looked small and fragile against the storm's violence, but there was nothing fragile about the way she handled that rope, the way she controlled her horse, the way she refused to let the cow escape. This girl, who had arrived barefoot and starving, was now saving cattle in the middle of a storm that would have sent most grown men running for shelter. Ethan felt something crack open in his chest. Not quite respect, though, that was part of it. Something deeper. Recognition of an equal. Of someone who could stand beside him, not behind him. They got the cattle settled under the trees, then rode back through the storm to check on the others. 3 cows had gone into labor, pushed into it early by the stress and fear. Ethan could see them lying on the ground, their bodies straining. The first delivered quickly, the calf sliding out wet and confused but alive. The mother began cleaning it immediately, her rough tongue working over its small body. The second needed help. Grace dismounted and went to the cow's head, speaking quietly, while Ethan positioned himself at the rear. He could see one leg emerging, but not the other. The calf was turned wrong. "Hold her," he called to Grace. She wrapped her arms around the cow's neck, her weight helping to keep the animal still. The cow bellowed a sound of pure agony that cut through even the storm's roar. Ethan stripped off his coat and rolled up his sleeves. He had done this dozens of times before, but never in conditions like this. Never in mud and rain and wind that threatened to knock him over. He reached inside the cow, his hands immediately covered in blood and birth fluid. The calf's leg was bent backward, trapped against the mother's pelvis. He had to push the calf back slightly, find the leg, straighten it, and guide it forward. The cow thrashed. Grace held on her face, pressed against the animal's neck, her voice a constant stream of reassurance that the cow probably could not understand but seemed to respond to anyway. Ethan found the leg, straightened it, felt the calf shift into a better position. "Now," he said, and the cow pushed. The calf slid out in a rush of fluid and blood landing in the mud. For a moment it did not move, just lay there still and silent while the rain pounded down. Grace was there immediately, clearing the calf's nose and mouth with her fingers, rubbing its body roughly with handfuls of wet grass. "Come on," she whispered. "Breathe. Please breathe." Nothing. Ethan knelt beside her, his heart sinking. They had been too late. The calf had suffocated during the difficult birth. But Grace was not giving up. She leaned down and blew into the calf's nostrils a steady stream of air directly into its lungs. Once, twice, 3 times. The calf's chest moved, then it coughed a wet rattling sound, and then it drew its first shaking breath. Grace sat back on her heels, tears mixing with the rain on her face. "It's alive," she said, her voice breaking. "It's alive." Ethan looked at her kneeling in the mud covered in blood and rain and dirt, and felt something he had not felt in 3 years. Not quite happiness, but close. A sense that life could still surprise him, that good things could still happen. They sat together in the storm, watching the calf struggle to its feet, watching the mother begin to clean her baby. And when Grace turned to look at him, her eyes bright with tears and triumph, Ethan found himself smiling for the first time since Margaret died. "You did good," he said. "We did good," she corrected. The third cow was having trouble, serious trouble. The calf was stuck, and the mother was exhausting herself trying to push it out. Ethan could see the problem immediately. Breech birth. The calf was coming backward, which meant suffocation was almost guaranteed. He worked quickly, trying to turn the calf inside the mother, but his hands were numb from cold and slick with fluids. The cow was tiring. They were running out of time. "Pull when I say," he told Grace. "Hard as you can." She grabbed the calf's emerging hooves with both hands, her face set with determination. When Ethan nodded, she pulled with all her strength. The calf came free suddenly, almost knocking Grace backward. It hit the ground and lay still. This one was worse. The calf had been without air for too long. Its tongue was blue, its eyes were dull. But Grace was already working, clearing the airway, rubbing the chest, breathing into the nostrils. She worked with a fierce intensity, refusing to accept failure. Minutes passed. The rain continued to pour. The mother cow stood and began nudging the calf with her nose, calling to it with low moos. Finally, the calf gasped, drew a breath, opened its eyes. Grace collapsed onto her side in the mud, exhausted. Ethan sat beside her, his own body spent. Around them the storm began to lose its fury. The rain eased from a deluge to a steady drumming. The wind dropped from a scream to a moan. They had survived, all of them. Cattle calves, horses, and 2 humans who had worked themselves past the point of exhaustion to make it happen. "Thank you," Ethan said quietly, "for staying, for helping. You saved that calf, both of them." Grace turned her head to look at him. "You saved them. I just helped." "No," he met her eyes. "We're partners in this. Equals. Don't forget that." Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that did not need words. They had faced the storm together and come through it stronger. Whatever happened next, they would face it together too. They rode back to the ranch as dawn broke the sky clearing to reveal a world washed clean. The prairie sparkled with water caught in grass and stone. The air smelled fresh, new, full of promise. At the house they stripped off their soaked clothes in separate rooms and changed into dry things. Ethan made coffee with shaking hands while Grace started a fire in the stove. They sat at the kitchen table in silence, letting warmth slowly seep back into their bones. "I've never done anything like that before," Grace said finally. "Helped birth a calf, I mean. You were a natural. I was terrified the whole time. Being terrified and doing it anyway, that's the definition of courage." Ethan wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. "You saved those calves, Grace. Without you, they would have died. Without you, I would have lost everything out there, or at least lost most of it." Grace looked at him across the table, her hair still damp and falling around her shoulders. Is it always like that? The work, I mean? Sometimes worse, sometimes better. Ranching isn't for the faint of heart. I'm not faint of heart. No, Ethan agreed quietly. You're not. 2 days after the storm, as they were assessing the damage and making repairs, a wagon came racing up the road. Fast, too fast. The kind of speed that meant emergency. Grace saw it first from the garden where she was replanting seeds the storm had washed away. "Ethan!" she called, alarm in her voice. He came running from the barn, Jake right behind him. They reached the yard just as the wagon skidded to a stop in a spray of gravel. A woman climbed down, nearly falling in her haste. Emma Carter. Grace recognized her from the brief encounter at the general store weeks ago. The one who had smiled had recognized Grace as a fellow outsider. But Emma was not smiling now. She was crying, her face twisted with terror. And in the wagon bed behind her lay a boy, maybe 10 years old, his face red and slick with sweat. "Please," Emma gasped. "Please, you have to help. Dr. Hayes is at the Dalton Ranch delivering a baby. He's been there since yesterday. I don't know when he'll be back. And my son Samuel, he's sick. I don't know what to do." Grace was already moving toward the wagon before Emma finished speaking. She climbed up beside the boy, her hands going immediately to his forehead. Burning. Fever so high she could feel the heat radiating from him even before she touched his skin. "How long has he been like this?" Grace asked, her voice calm, despite the fear rising in her chest. "Since yesterday morning. Started as a stomach ache. Then the fever came. He's been vomiting, can't keep anything down, and the pain keeps getting worse." Emma's voice cracked. "Please. I know people say things about you, but I don't care. Please help my son." Grace examined Samuel carefully, her mind racing through everything her mother had taught her. Fever, vomiting, abdominal pain. She pressed gently on his stomach, feeling the resistance there. When she pressed on the lower right side, Samuel cried out even in his semi-conscious state. She released the pressure quickly, and he cried out again. Rebound tenderness. The classic sign. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. When the belly is hard and the pain is sharp on one side, when fever comes fast and high, that's appendicitis. And if it bursts, the poison spreads through the whole body. Death in hours, maybe less. Grace had seen her mother treat this once. A young man brought to their farm in Nebraska barely alive. Her mother had operated by firelight, cutting into his abdomen to remove the inflamed appendix. The man had lived, though it had been close. But Grace had only watched, had only assisted. She had never done the surgery herself. "Bring him inside," she said, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. "Quickly!" Ethan and Jake lifted Samuel from the wagon, carrying him into the house and laying him on Ethan's bed. Grace followed, her mind already cataloging what she would need. Boiled water, clean cloth, needle and thread, willow bark for fever, something to dull the pain. Emma hovered in the doorway, wringing her hands. "Is he going to be all right? What's wrong with him?" Grace turned to face her, knowing she had to tell the truth even though it would terrify Emma more. "It's his appendix. The organ is inflamed and could rupture at any time. He needs surgery to remove it." "Surgery?" Emma's face went white. "But you're not a doctor." "No, I'm not." Grace met her eyes steadily. "But Dr. Hayes isn't here, and your son doesn't have time to wait. If we don't operate soon, he'll die." The words hung in the air, brutal and unavoidable. Emma swayed and Ethan caught her elbow. "Mrs. Carter, did you try to get help before coming here?" Emma nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I went to Mrs. Brennan first. She's head of the church charity. I thought she could help, or at least tell me what to do, but she said I was overreacting, that Samuel just needed discipline and prayer, that I was coddling him." Grace felt cold fury settle in her stomach. Mrs. Brennan had turned away a mother with a dying child, had sent them home when immediate help could have saved time, could have made the difference between life and death. "How long ago?" Grace asked. "Yesterday afternoon, about this time." Emma looked at Samuel, her voice breaking. "I should have trusted my instincts." Should have come here first, but I was scared. Of what people would say, of what Mrs. Brennan would do if she found out I'd gone against her advice. None of that matters now. Grace moved to the bed, checking Samuel's pulse. Rapid, but strong. His breathing was shallow, labored, but he was still alive, still fighting. What matters is helping Samuel. Ethan, I need you to ride to the Dalton Ranch. Bring Dr. Hayes here immediately. Ethan was already moving toward the door. How much time do we have? Hours, maybe less. Grace began unbuttoning Samuel's shirt, examining his abdomen more carefully. The swelling was obvious now, the skin tight and hot. Go fast. He was gone without another word, his boots pounding across the porch and down the steps. Grace heard the thunder of hooves as he rode out at a gallop. Now she was alone with a dying boy and a terrified mother. Emma. Grace kept her voice steady, projecting a confidence she did not feel. I need you to help me. Can you do that? Emma straightened, wiping her eyes. Yes. Tell me what to do. Pump water and put it on to boil, as much as you can. We need everything sterile. Then bring me every clean towel and sheet you can find. While Emma worked, Grace prepared what she would need. She had willow bark tea already steeped, kept ready for emergencies. She gave Samuel small sips, trying to bring down his fever. She placed cool compresses on his forehead. She monitored his pulse and breathing, watching for signs that the appendix had ruptured. If it burst before Dr. Hayes arrived, there would be nothing anyone could do. Jake appeared in the doorway. What can I do? Pray, Grace said. Pray that Ethan rides fast and that Dr. Hayes can come immediately. The next 2 hours were the longest of Grace's life. She stayed by Samuel's side, cooling his fever, checking for signs of worsening. Emma sat on the other side of the bed, holding her son's hand, her lips moving in silent prayer. Finally, mercifully, they heard horses. Multiple riders coming fast. Ethan burst through the door first, followed by an older man carrying a black medical bag. Dr. William Hayes. Grace had seen him once in town, a gray-haired gentleman in his 60s with kind eyes and steady hands. Those eyes took in the scene quickly. The boy on the bed, Grace with her compress and tea, Emma's tear-stained face. He moved to the bedside immediately, his hands already examining Samuel's abdomen. His face went grim. Appendicitis. Advanced. I need to operate immediately or he'll die. He looked at Grace, then really looked at her. You kept him alive, kept the fever manageable, kept him hydrated. You might have saved his life just by that. Grace felt something loosen in her chest. Validation from someone who actually knew medicine. What do you need me to do? Assist me. Dr. Hayes began unpacking his bag. I can't do this surgery alone, and I don't have time to send for someone else. You're clearly intelligent, and you've got steady hands. Are you willing? Grace's heart hammered. She was not trained, was not qualified. Everything she knew came from watching her mother from books she had read from instinct. But Samuel was dying, and Dr. Hayes needed help. Yes, she said. Tell me what to do. Emma stood, her face pale. No. She's just a girl. She can't. She's the only one here who can. Dr. Hayes's voice was firm, but not unkind. Mrs. Carter, I understand your fear, but your son is running out of time. I need Miss Bennett's help. Please trust me. Emma looked at Grace, then at her dying son. Finally, she nodded. Save him. Please. Jake led Emma from the room. Grace could hear her sobbing in the kitchen, the sound muffled but heartbreaking. Dr. Hayes worked quickly, laying out instruments on a clean towel. Scalpel, clamps, retractors, needle, catgut thread for suturing, a small bottle of chloroform. Have you ever administered anesthesia? He asked Grace. No. Watch carefully. He showed her how to pour drops onto a cloth, how to hold it over Samuel's nose and mouth. Count his breaths. Too fast, use less. Too slow, pull it away immediately. His life depends on you getting this right. Grace nodded, her mouth dry. This was real. This was happening. She was about to help perform surgery on a dying child. Dr. Hayes positioned Samuel flat on his back, adjusted the lamp to give better light. Ready. Ready. Grace held the chloroform cloth over Samuel's face, counting drops as Dr. Hayes had shown her. 1, 2, 3. Samuel's breathing began to slow, his body relaxing as the anesthetic took effect. "Good," Dr. Hayes said. "Keep it steady." He picked up the scalpel and made the first incision. The next hour passed in a blur of blood and precise movements. Grace watched, fascinated and horrified, as Dr. Hayes cut through skin and muscle to expose Samuel's abdomen. She passed instruments when he asked for them, held retractors to keep the wound open, wiped away blood so he could see. The appendix was easy to spot once they found it. Swollen, red, angry-looking, but intact. Another hour and it would have burst, filling Samuel's abdomen with infection. "See that, doctor?" Hayes's voice was calm, almost conversational, despite the blood on his hands. "That's what we're removing. Grace, I need the small clamp." "No, the other one." "Good." He worked methodically, tying off blood vessels, isolating the appendix, preparing to remove it. Then suddenly blood. More than before, welling up from somewhere deep. "Clamp." Dr. Hayes' voice was sharp. "The larger one. Now." Grace's hands moved without thought, finding the instrument and placing it in his palm. Dr. Hayes clamped the bleeding vessel, his face tight with concentration. For a terrible moment, Grace thought they were going to lose Samuel right there on the table. But Dr. Hayes got the bleeding under control, tied off the vessel, and continued working. The appendix came free. He placed it in a basin, then began the careful work of closing the layers of Samuel's abdomen. Internal sutures first, then the muscle, then finally the skin. The last stitch went in. "Doctor." Hayes tied it off and stepped back, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. "Done," he said simply. "He'll live." Grace felt her legs go weak. She had to brace herself against the bedpost to stay upright. "We did it. He's going to be all right." "You did it," Dr. Hayes corrected. "I've performed hundreds of surgeries, Miss Bennett, but I've never had an assistant catch on so quickly, stay so calm under pressure. You have a gift for this." Before Grace could respond, Emma burst into the room, Jake unable to hold her back any longer. She rushed to Samuel's side, her hands hovering over him as if afraid to touch. "Is he—" "He's alive," Grace said. "The surgery was successful. Dr. Hayes removed the appendix. Samuel will need careful nursing for the next week, but he should make a full recovery." Emma collapsed into the chair beside the bed, sobbing with relief. "Thank you. Thank you both. I don't know how to repay you." "Take care of your son," Dr. Hayes said gently. "That's payment enough." He turned to Grace, his expression serious. "Miss Bennett, might I have a word with you outside?" They stepped onto the porch, leaving Emma with Samuel. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. It seemed impossible that so much could have happened in a single day. "You have real talent," Dr. Hayes said without preamble. "Natural instinct that can't be taught. I'd like to work with you, teach you what I know. Unofficially, of course. You're not a licensed physician and probably never will be. But this territory needs healers, and you could be one of the best." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "You'd do that? Even though I'm not trained? Even though people would criticize you?" "People have been criticizing me for 40 years. I'm too old to care anymore." He smiled. "Besides, watching you work today reminded me why I became a doctor in the first place. To help people, to pass on knowledge, to train the next generation. If you're willing to learn, I'm willing to teach." "Yes," Grace said immediately. "Yes, I want to learn." They shook hands, and Grace felt something shift inside her, a sense of purpose solidifying. This was what she was meant to do. This was her calling. But she also felt a tremor of fear, because news of this surgery would spread, and when it did, Mrs. Brennan would come for them. The confrontation happened 3 days later. Samuel was recovering well under Grace's care. Emma had stayed at the ranch, refusing to leave her son's side. Dr. Hayes had visited twice to check on the boy's progress and had pronounced himself satisfied. Word had spread through the community faster than wildfire. Emma had told people what happened, how Mrs. Brennan had turned her away, how Grace had saved Samuel's life, how Dr. Hayes himself had praised Grace's skill. The town was dividing. Some people began to question Mrs. Brennan's authority. Others doubled down in their support of her, insisting that Grace had gotten lucky and was dangerous. Grace was in the garden when she heard the horses. Multiple riders more than before. She straightened, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. 8 people this time. Mrs. Brennan at the head, her face set in lines of cold fury. Frank Dalton and 2 of his men. Pastor Bennett looking uncomfortable. Sheriff Morgan looking even more uncomfortable. And 2 women Grace did not recognize, both wearing expressions of righteous judgment. Ethan emerged from the barn, Jake beside him. They positioned themselves between the riders and Grace. "Cole," Mrs. Brennan's voice could have frozen water. "We need to discuss a very serious matter." "Then discuss it," Ethan said flatly. Mrs. Brennan's eyes found Grace standing in the garden with dirt on her hands. "Miss Bennett, you've been practicing medicine without proper training or authority. This cannot be allowed to continue." Grace wiped her hands on her apron and walked forward. She was not going to hide, not anymore. "I helped a sick child. Nothing more. You performed medical procedures beyond your competence. You assisted in surgery, administered medications, made diagnoses. These are actions reserved for trained physicians, not—" She paused, her lips curling. "Not orphan girls playing nurse." "I saved Samuel Carter's life," Grace said, her voice steady. "Dr. Hayes is being investigated for allowing an untrained assistant to participate in a medical procedure." Mrs. Brennan's smile was cold. "And while we're grateful the boy survived, that doesn't change the fact that you overstepped badly." "There's no law against helping people," Sheriff Morgan said, but his voice lacked conviction. "There are standards of practice, community standards." Mrs. Brennan turned to Ethan. "Surely you understand the danger of allowing this girl to continue down this path. If something goes wrong, if someone dies under her care, the legal ramifications alone—" "Nobody's died," Ethan interrupted. "In fact, the only person who almost died was Samuel, and that was because you turned his mother away." The group shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Brennan's face went white, then red. "How dare you! Emma Carter came to you for help." Ethan continued, his voice hard. "Her son was dying, and you sent her away, told her he just needed discipline and prayer. If Emma had listened to you, if she hadn't come here, Samuel would be dead right now." "This isn't about me." But Mrs. Brennan's voice wavered. "It's entirely about you." Ethan took a step forward. "You didn't help Samuel because Emma isn't important enough, isn't part of your social circle. And when Grace saved him, when she did what you should have done, you couldn't stand it. So now you're here trying to make her the villain in a story where she's the only hero." Pastor Bennett spoke up, his voice quiet. "Mrs. Brennan, perhaps we should reconsider." "No," she cut him off. "This is about protecting our community, about maintaining standards. Miss Bennett must cease all medical activities immediately. She must submit to proper supervision, and—" She looked at Ethan. "She must leave this ranch, for the sake of her own reputation and yours." The ultimatum hung in the air, brutal and final. Ethan met her gaze without flinching. "No, Grace stays. She keeps helping people who need it. And you can take your ultimatum and your standards and get off my land." "The town won't stand for this," Mrs. Brennan said, her voice shaking with fury. "Let them try." Ethan's hand moved to his pistol, not drawing, but making his position clear. "You've got 30 seconds to leave before I help you along." Mrs. Brennan stared at him, then at Grace, then back at Ethan. Her face twisted with rage and something else. Hurt, maybe, or recognition of defeat. "You'll regret this," she said. "Both of you. Mark my words." She wheeled her horse around and rode off, the others following. Only Sheriff Morgan lingered a moment. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "what Miss Bennett did was right. Helping people isn't a crime, no matter what anyone says." Then he too was gone, leaving Ethan and Grace alone in the yard. Grace walked to Ethan's side, her heart pounding. "You shouldn't have done that. She'll make your life impossible now." "Let her try." Ethan looked down at her. "Whatever happens, we face it together. Remember." Grace nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. From the house they heard Emma call out, "Grace, Samuel's asking for you." Grace hurried inside, leaving Ethan standing in the yard. He watched her go, then turned his eyes toward the horizon where storm clouds were gathering again. Different clouds this time. Not rain, but something darker. War was coming. He could feel it. But this time he would not face it alone. The summons came on a gray afternoon when the sky hung low and threatening. Jake rode in fast, his face grim, and Ethan knew before he spoke that something had gone wrong. "Ruth Foster," Jake said, dismounting in a single fluid motion. "She's dying. Maybe already dead. James sent me to find you." Grace emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. She had been grinding herbs, preparing medicines for the small but growing number of people who came seeking her help. "Ruth? The pregnant woman who lives near the Dalton Ranch." "That's her." Jake's voice was heavy. "James wanted Grace to come 2 days ago. Said Ruth was bleeding, having pains, but Ruth refused. Said Mrs. Brennan had visited, told her Grace was dangerous, that she should rest and pray, nothing more." The words hit Grace like a physical blow. Another one. Another person who might die because of Mrs. Brennan's interference. "We have to go," she said, already moving toward the barn. "Now." But Ethan caught her arm, his grip gentle but firm. "Grace, if she's already gone, there's nothing you can do. And if she's not, if she's dying right now, you'll carry that weight. Are you ready for that?" Grace met his eyes. In the weeks since Samuel's surgery, she had helped dozens of people. Cuts and bruises and fevers and pains. She had saved everyone who had come to her. But she had never lost anyone. Had never watched someone die despite her best efforts. "I have to try," she said simply. They rode hard, the three of them. The Foster place was only 3 miles away, but it felt like 30. Grace's mind raced through everything she knew about childbirth complications. Bleeding could mean so many things. Placental problems, uterine rupture, hemorrhage. Some could be treated. Others were death sentences. They arrived to find Dr. Hayes' buggy already outside the small farmhouse. That was a bad sign. It meant James had finally gotten word to the doctor. It meant things were serious enough that no one cared anymore what Mrs. Brennan thought. James Foster met them at the door. He was 28, a ranch hand for Dalton, a good man by all accounts. But now he looked like he had aged 20 years in 2 days. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. "Too late," he said, his voice breaking. "She's gone. The baby, too." Grace felt the words like a knife to the chest. She pushed past James into the house, needing to see for herself, needing to confirm what she already knew in her heart. Ruth Foster lay on the bed, still and pale. Her hands were folded across her chest and someone had closed her eyes. She looked peaceful, almost as if she were sleeping. But the blood-stained sheets told a different story. So much blood. Dr. Hayes stood beside the bed, his medical bag packed and ready. His face was carved from stone grief and anger, mixing in equal measure. "Placental abruption," he said when he saw Grace. The placenta separated from the uterine wall. She bled out internally. By the time James came for me, there was nothing anyone could do. She'd been bleeding for hours, maybe longer. Could she have been saved? Grace's voice was barely a whisper. If someone had come sooner. Yes. Dr. Hayes' answer was unequivocal. Absolutely yes. This was entirely preventable. If she'd gotten help when the symptoms started, if someone with medical knowledge had examined her, we could have delivered the baby early. Both would likely have survived. He turned to James, who had followed them inside. I need you to tell me exactly what happened, from the beginning. James sank into a chair, his head in his hands. 2 days ago, Ruth started having pains and bleeding. Not much at first, but enough to scare her. I wanted to go for Grace immediately. I'd heard what she did for Samuel Carter, but Ruth wouldn't let me. Why not? Ethan asked gently. Mrs. Brennan. James's voice filled with bitter rage. She'd come to visit 3 days ago, checking on Ruth like she does with all the pregnant women in the area. Ruth told her about some cramping, some spotting. Nothing serious yet, but Ruth was worried. and Mrs. Brennan told her that Grace Bennett was a charlatan, a dangerous girl playing at medicine, that if Ruth went to her she'd probably end up dead. Grace felt cold spreading through her chest. Mrs. Brennan had poisoned Ruth against her, had planted seeds of fear and doubt that cost 2 lives. What did Mrs. Brennan suggest instead? Dr. Hayes asked, though his tone said he already knew the answer. Rest. Prayer. She said Ruth was just nervous that first time. Mothers always worry too much. She promised to check on us in a few days. James looked up, his face twisted with anguish. But she never came back. And when the bleeding got worse, when Ruth was crying from the pain, she still refused to let me get Grace. She was so scared. Kept saying Mrs. Brennan warned her that if she went to Grace, she'd be risking her soul along with her body. So what did you do? Ethan's voice was quiet. I watched my wife die. James's voice broke completely. I held her hand and watched her bleed to death because she was too frightened of gossip to accept help. This morning she finally passed. The baby had been dead for hours by then. The room fell silent except for James's ragged breathing. Grace felt tears streaming down her face. This was her fault. If she had been more assertive, if she had gone to Ruth anyway, if she had fought harder against Mrs. Brennan's influence. But Ethan's hand on her shoulder stopped that spiral of guilt. This is not on you, he said firmly. This is on the woman who used fear and lies to control people, who valued her authority more than human lives. He's right, Dr. Hayes added. I've examined Mrs. Foster's body. This was preventable, but only if she'd accepted help. You can't save someone who refuses to be saved, Grace, no matter how skilled you are. Grace nodded, but the words felt hollow. Another person dead. Another family destroyed. And for what? To protect Mrs. Brennan's pride. I'm going to tell everyone what happened, James said suddenly. His voice was hard now, filled with determination. At the funeral, in front of the whole town, they need to know what she did, what her advice cost me. 3 days later, the entire town of Redemption Springs gathered for Ruth Foster's funeral. The small church was packed with people, more than 100 souls crammed into pews meant for 70. They overflowed into the aisles, stood along the walls, filled the doorway. Everyone came. Because death was still rare enough to matter. Because Ruth had been young and well-liked. Because her story had spread through the community like poison, dividing people even further. Mrs. Brennan sat in her usual place at the front, dressed in black, her face set in an expression of pious sorrow. She had been quieter since the confrontation at Ethan's ranch, but no less present, no less influential. Her supporters still outnumbered her detractors, at least publicly. Grace sat in the back row with Ethan and Jake. She had debated not coming at all, worried her presence would cause a scene. But Ethan had insisted. You have as much right to mourn as anyone, he had said. More maybe, because you could have saved her. Pastor Bennett stood at the pulpit, his Bible open before him. He looked older than his 47 years, his face lined with exhaustion. He had been trapped between his conscience and his congregation for weeks now, watching the town tear itself apart over Grace and Mrs. Brennan. We gather today to mourn the loss of Ruth Foster and her unborn child. He began, his voice heavy, to commit their souls to God's keeping and to offer comfort to James in his time of grief. Death is never easy, but when it takes the young, when it takes a mother and child together, it feels especially cruel. He continued with the traditional funeral liturgy, speaking of God's will and eternal rest and the hope of resurrection. Grace barely heard the words. She was watching James, who sat in the front row staring at his wife's closed casket with eyes that saw nothing. Pastor Bennett was nearing the end of his sermon when James stood abruptly. The movement was so sudden, so unexpected, that the pastor stopped mid-sentence. I have something to say, James announced, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. Pastor Bennett hesitated, then stepped aside. Of course, James, the floor is yours. James turned to face the congregation. His eyes were dry now, but they burned with a terrible intensity. My wife is dead. My child is dead. And I want everyone here to know why. A murmur ran through the crowd. Mrs. Brennan shifted in her seat, her hands clenching. Ruth died of a medical condition called placental abruption. James continued. Dr. Hayes has explained it to me. It's when the placenta separates from the womb before the baby is born. It causes bleeding, internal bleeding that you can't always see, and if it's not treated quickly, both mother and baby die. His voice cracked, but he pushed through. Ruth started showing symptoms 2 days before she died. Cramping, spotting. She was scared. I wanted to get help immediately. Wanted to ride to the Cole Ranch and bring back Grace Bennett, who'd saved Samuel Carter just weeks before, but Ruth wouldn't let me. The murmur grew louder. People shifted, exchanged glances. Grace felt Ethan's hand find hers, squeezing tight. Why wouldn't she accept help? James asked, though everyone in the room knew he was about to answer his own question. Because 3 days before she died, Mrs. Brennan came to visit, and when Ruth mentioned her concerns, Mrs. Brennan told her that Grace Bennett was dangerous. A charlatan, an untrained girl who'd gotten lucky once but would probably kill someone eventually. All eyes turned to Mrs. Brennan. She sat frozen, her face pale. Mrs. Brennan told my wife that all Ruth needed was rest and prayer. James continued, his voice rising. She promised to check on her in a few days, but she never came back. And when Ruth's condition worsened, when she was bleeding and crying from pain, she still refused to let me get Grace, because she was terrified, because Mrs. Brennan had convinced her that accepting help from Grace would be worse than death itself. This is outrageous, Mrs. Brennan said, rising to her feet. I gave sound medical advice based on years of experience. How was I to know the girl was genuinely ill? You could have examined her, Dr. Hayes said, standing as well. You could have looked at her symptoms. You could have called for me. You could have done anything except send her away with empty platitudes. I am not a medical professional, Mrs. Brennan protested. I have no training. Exactly. Dr. Hayes's voice was hard. You have no training. But you positioned yourself as an authority anyway, and when someone with actual skill and knowledge appeared, you felt threatened. So you spread lies to maintain your control, and Ruth Foster died because of it. The church erupted into chaos, people shouting, arguing, defending, or condemning. Pastor Bennett called for order, but his voice was lost in the tumult. Then Emma Carter stood Samuel beside her. The boy was healthy now, back to his normal, energetic self. He clutched his mother's hand as she spoke. Mrs. Brennan told me my son just needed discipline, Emma said, her voice shaking but clear. Said I was coddling him, that he needed a firm hand and prayer, nothing more. If I had listened to her, if I hadn't gone to Grace Bennett, Samuel would be dead right now. She looked at Grace, her eyes shining with tears and gratitude. Grace saved my son's life. Dr. Hayes himself said so. She has a gift that this community needs, and I'm done pretending otherwise because of one woman's pride. More people stood. Widow Mallister, the Peterson family, Tom, the ranch hand whose arm Grace had stitched. One by one they shared their stories, how Grace had helped them, how her knowledge and skill had eased suffering, prevented complications, possibly saved lives. The tide was turning. Grace could feel it. The careful authority Mrs. Brennan had built over decades was crumbling under the weight of truth. But Mrs. Brennan was not finished. She stood again, her face flushed, her voice desperate. You don't understand. I was trying to protect you all, to maintain standards in this community, to keep people safe. Safe from what? James demanded. From competent medical care, from someone who actually gives a damn whether people live or die. Safe from sin. Mrs. Brennan's control shattered. Her voice rose to a near scream. From the corruption that comes when we abandon proper moral authority, when we let anyone, no matter how unqualified, claim the right to make life and death decisions. This isn't about qualifications, Pastor Bennett said quietly. He had moved from behind the pulpit and now stood in the aisle looking at Mrs. Brennan with something like pity. This is about fear, about using fear to control people. Mrs. Brennan turned on him, her eyes wild. You know nothing about fear, about what it's like to be cast out, to be judged and found wanting, about having to claw your way back to respectability, one painful step at a time. Her voice broke, and suddenly, shockingly, she was crying. Not delicate tears, but harsh, ugly sobs that shook her whole body. "You want to know why I fought so hard?" she gasped. "Why I couldn't stand the sight of that girl living with Cole unchaperoned and unashamed, because I saw myself. I saw the mistake I made when I was young, when I trusted a man who promised me the world and gave me nothing but ruin." The church had gone silent again. People leaned forward, hungry for scandal. "I was 17. Mrs. Brennan continued, her voice raw. "A foolish girl who believed in love. I got pregnant, and when I told the father, he left, just packed up and disappeared. My family cast me out. The town labeled me a whore. I lost the baby, miscarriage in my 4th month, and I almost died from the bleeding." She looked at Grace, and her expression was complex. Resentment and recognition, and something almost like kinship. "When I saw you living with a bachelor working for wages, people starting to respect you despite everything that should have made you an outcast, I was terrified. Terrified that you were making it look easy, that you were succeeding where I had failed, that your presence was proving that everything I'd built, all the rules I'd enforced, all the control I'd maintained was unnecessary. So you tried to destroy her," Ethan said, his voice cutting through Mrs. Brennan's confession. "You tried to tear down a girl who'd done nothing wrong except survive, and in the process you killed Ruth Foster." Mrs. Brennan flinched as if struck. "I didn't mean for her to die. I never wanted anyone to die. I just wanted to maintain order, to protect the standards that kept me safe." "Your standards killed my wife," James said flatly. Mrs. Brennan had no answer to that. She stood in the center of the church, surrounded by people who had once followed her without question and saw only condemnation in their eyes. "I think," Pastor Bennett said carefully, "that it's time for you to step down from your position, Charlotte, for your own sake as much as the community's." Mrs. Brennan looked at him, then at the congregation, searching for support for someone who would defend her, but even her most loyal followers had gone quiet. Finally, she walked down the aisle toward the door, her step slow and heavy. People parted to let her pass. No one spoke. No one reached out to comfort her. At the door she paused and turned back. Her eyes found Grace. "I'm sorry," she said so quietly that Grace almost missed it. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry." Then she was gone, and the church felt somehow larger without her. The funeral continued, but everything had changed. Pastor Bennett spoke briefly about forgiveness and mercy, about learning from tragedy and moving forward. Then they carried Ruth's casket to the small cemetery on the hill and laid her to rest beside her stillborn child. James stood at the graveside long after everyone else had left, staring at the fresh earth. Grace approached hesitantly, not sure if her presence would help or hurt. "I'm so sorry," she said. "If I had known, if I had come anyway." "Don't," James interrupted. "Don't take this on yourself. Ruth made her choice. A choice based on fear and lies, but still her choice. You can't save people who refuse to be saved." Dr. Hayes said the same thing. "Because it's true." James finally looked at her. "But you can save the next person, and the one after that. So please, Miss Bennett, don't let guilt stop you from helping people. Ruth's death means something if it opens people's eyes. Don't waste that." Grace nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. As she walked back toward where Ethan waited, someone else approached her. Pastor Bennett, looking nervous. "Miss Bennett, might I have a word in private?" They walked a short distance from the others, far enough for privacy, but close enough to remain proper. The pastor's hands twisted together, and he would not meet her eyes. "There's something I need to tell you," he said finally. "Something I should have told you weeks ago, months ago, years ago, if I'm being honest." Grace waited, confused. "Your mother, her name was Sarah Bennett, before she married." Grace's heart stuttered. "How do you know my mother's name?" "Because I knew her. 17 years ago I was a very different man, younger, more foolish. I was traveling through Nebraska, preaching at revivals, trying to find my calling, and I met Sarah. She was beautiful and kind and half Cherokee, which should have warned me that my family would never accept her. But I didn't care. I fell in love. The world seemed to tilt beneath Grace's feet. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I am your father." Pastor Bennett finally looked at her, his eyes wet. "Sarah got pregnant, and I panicked. I was 23, terrified of what my family would say, terrified of being tied to a woman my community would never accept. So I left. Just disappeared one night without even saying goodbye." Grace felt like she had been punched. All the breath left her lungs. Her vision narrowed to a point. "I learned later that Sarah married," the pastor continued, his voice thick with shame, "a good man named Thomas Miller, who accepted both her and the baby, who raised you as his own. I told myself that meant everything was fine, that I could just forget what I'd done and move on." "But you couldn't," Grace said, her voice hollow. "No, I never could. And when you appeared in Redemption Springs, when I heard your name and saw your face, I knew immediately. You have Sarah's eyes, her bone structure. And suddenly I was faced with the consequence of my cowardice. My daughter orphaned and desperate, and I could do nothing to acknowledge you without destroying my own life. So why tell me now?" Because watching Mrs. Brennan's confession, hearing her talk about her own mistakes and the price of silence, I realized I couldn't keep hiding. You deserve to know the truth, and I deserve whatever judgment comes from that truth. Grace looked at this man who claimed to be her father, tried to find some connection, some sense of recognition, but all she felt was anger. "My parents died of cholera," she said. "The people who raised me, who loved me, who taught me everything I know. Thomas Miller was my father, not you. You're just the man who abandoned my mother." Pastor Bennett flinched but nodded. "You're right. I have no claim to you, no right to call myself your father. But I want you to know that despite my cowardice, despite every terrible decision I've made, I've been trying to help. The church building I offered for your clinic, the way I've tried to advocate for you even when it cost me Mrs. Brennan's approval. It's not enough. It will never be enough. But it's all I have to offer." Grace wanted to rage at him, wanted to scream and cry and demand to know how he could have left her mother alone and pregnant. But she was too tired, too worn down by loss and grief and the weight of expectations. "I don't need you to be my father," she said finally. "That position is already filled by a better man, but if you want to help, if you want to make amends for what you did to my mother, then stand up for me. Stand up for what's right, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." "I will," he promised. "I swear to you I will." They walked back to the others in silence. Grace's mind was reeling, but she pushed the revelations aside. She would process them later. Right now she had people waiting, people who needed her. In the days following the funeral, everything changed. Mrs. Brennan withdrew from public life almost entirely. She attended church but sat in the back, spoke to no one, and left immediately after services. The Women's Auxiliary elected Emma Carter as their new leader. The church board voted to officially offer Grace the use of the old schoolhouse building as a medical clinic. Dr. Hayes began visiting the ranch twice a week, bringing medical texts and teaching Grace everything he knew: anatomy, diagnosis, treatment protocols. She absorbed it all like parched earth drinking rain. People came to her now without hesitation. The trickle of patients became a stream, cuts and bruises and fevers. Yes, but also more serious cases. A man with a badly set broken arm that needed to be rebroken and reset. A woman with an infection that required lancing and draining. A child who had swallowed lye and needed careful monitoring. Grace treated them all, learning as she went, building her skills one patient at a time. And through it all, Ethan was there, helping set up the clinic, bringing supplies, standing guard when angry husbands or fathers questioned whether a young woman should be examining their wives and daughters, defending her competence to anyone who would listen. They had become partners in every sense, working side by side, making decisions together, building something larger than either of them alone. But they had never named what was growing between them, never acknowledged that it had become more than employer and employee, more than friendship, something that neither was quite ready to define. until one evening in late October when the air turned cool and the leaves on the cottonwoods blazed gold. They were sitting on the porch after a long day watching the sun set over the prairie. Grace had just returned from the clinic where she had helped deliver her first baby, a healthy girl who had come into the world squalling and perfect. The mother had cried with relief. The father had pressed $5 into Grace's hand, more money than he probably had to spare. It had been one of the best days of Grace's life. "You look happy," Ethan observed. "I am." Grace pulled her shawl tighter against the evening chill. "Today felt like everything I've been working toward finally made sense, like I found what I'm meant to do." "You're a healer. It's who you are." "Thanks to you." She turned to look at him. "If you hadn't taken me in, if you hadn't stood up for me, I'd probably be working for some family for nothing but room and board, or married off to whoever would take me. I'd never have had this chance." "You would have found a way," Ethan said. "You're too strong not to." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Grace said, "I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" "About what this is, between us." She felt her heart hammering but forced herself to continue. "When I first came here, it was temporary, a place to rest until I figured out what to do next. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being temporary. This became home. You became—" She stopped searching for words. Ethan was very still. "I became what—" Grace took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "You became the person I think about first when something good happens. The one I want to share my day with, the one whose opinion matters most, and I realize that I don't want this arrangement to be temporary anymore. I want it to be permanent." "Grace," Ethan began, but she held up a hand. "Let me finish, please." She stood and walked to stand in front of him. "I know this is unconventional. I know women aren't supposed to speak first, but I've never been conventional and I don't want to start now. So I'm going to ask you something, and if the answer is no, we can forget this conversation ever happened." She knelt down so they were at eye level, took his hands in hers. "Ethan Cole, will you marry me?" The question hung in the air between them. Ethan stared at her, shock written clearly on his face. "You're proposing to me?" "Yes." "Grace, you don't have to do this. I never expected, I never asked." "I know you didn't ask. I'm asking. Because I love you." The words came easier now, gaining strength as she spoke them. "I love your steadiness, your integrity, the way you see me as I really am and value what you find. I love that you stood beside me when everyone else stood against us, that you gave me not just shelter, but dignity and purpose." She squeezed his hands. "I'm not doing this out of gratitude. I'm doing this because somewhere between the storm and the surgery and all the quiet moments in between, I fell in love with you, and I want to spend my life as your partner, if you'll have me." Ethan was silent for a long moment. Then slowly, incredibly, he began to laugh. Not mockery, but joy, pure and unguarded. He pulled Grace to her feet and into his arms, holding her tight. "Yes," he said into her hair. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." He pulled back to look at her, his eyes wet. "I thought I was done with happiness when Margaret died. Thought that part of my life was over. But you came into it like a storm, turned everything upside down, and reminded me what it feels like to want to live instead of just survive. So yes, Grace Bennett, I will marry you. I would be honored to marry you." They kissed then for the first time. It was tender and passionate and full of promise, full of hope for a future that had seemed impossible just months ago. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling. "We're going to scandalize the town," Grace said. "We've been doing that for months. Might as well make it official." The wedding was small, held at the ranch on a clear November afternoon. The sky was the deep blue of approaching winter, and the air carried the sharp scent of coming frost. Pastor Bennett officiated, which felt right somehow. Grace had not forgiven him, not fully, might never forgive him completely, but she could accept his help, could allow him this small act of penance. 30 people attended. Emma, Carter, and Samuel, who ran around chasing chickens until his mother made him settle down. Dr. Hayes looking pleased and a little smug, as if he had predicted this outcome all along. Jake Miller standing as Ethan's best man, his eyes suspiciously bright. Widow Mallister, the Peterson family, Tom and several other ranch hands. James Foster still grieving but trying to find his way back to life. Even Sheriff Morgan came bringing his wife, a quiet woman who pressed a jar of preserves into Grace's hands and whispered that she was glad Grace had come to Redemption Springs. Mrs. Brennan did not attend, but the afternoon before the wedding, Grace found a package on the porch. Inside was a length of beautiful white lace, old and delicate, and a note in spidery handwriting. "For your wedding dress. It was my mother's. I hope it brings you more joy than my life has brought me." Grace used the lace to trim the blue dress Emma had sewn for her. It was beautiful in its simplicity, and when she walked out of the house to meet Ethan, she saw his breath catch. "You look like hope," he said quietly, "like every good thing I thought I'd lost." The ceremony itself was brief, traditional vows with a few modifications. When Pastor Bennett asked if anyone objected to the union, Jake called out, "About damn time," and everyone laughed. Ethan's vows were simple but sincere. "I, Ethan Cole, take you, Grace Bennett, as my wife, to stand beside, not behind or in front of, to partner with in all things, to love and honor for as long as we both live." Grace's vows came from her heart. "I, Grace Bennett, take you, Ethan Cole, as my husband, to walk beside through whatever comes, to build a life of purpose and meaning together, to love you not because you saved me, but because we saved each other. I now pronounce you husband and wife," Pastor Bennett said, his voice thick with emotion. They kissed while their friends cheered, and Grace felt something she had not felt since the morning her parents died. Not just hope, but certainty, that she was exactly where she belonged, that she had found not just a home but a purpose, not just survival, but a life worth living. The reception was held in the barn, which Jake and Ethan had cleaned and decorated with wildflowers and ribbons. There was food, simple but plentiful, music from a fiddle player who had traveled from a neighboring ranch, dancing that went on until the stars came out. Dr. Hayes raised a toast. "To Ethan and Grace, two people who proved that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to do what's right despite it. May your marriage be blessed with health, happiness, and many years of partnership." Everyone drank to that. As the party wound down and guests began to depart, Grace found herself standing with Emma, watching Samuel play with the other children. "Thank you," Emma said quietly, "for everything, for saving my son, for showing me that it's possible to stand up for yourself even when everyone says you're wrong." "You stood up too," Grace reminded her. "At the funeral, that took courage." "Maybe, but you taught me how." Emma smiled. "I'm glad you're staying. Redemption Springs needs you." After the last guest left, Ethan and Grace stood alone in the yard looking up at the stars. The prairie stretched out around them, vast and dark and full of possibility. "What happens now?" Grace asked. "Now we build our life together." Ethan pulled her close. "You run your clinic. I run the ranch. We figure it out as we go. What about Mrs. Brennan and Dalton and all the people who still don't approve? Let them disapprove. We're not living for them. We're living for us." Grace leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart. 6 months ago she had been a girl hiding in a root cellar, certain she had lost everything. Now she was a wife, a healer, a woman who had found her place in the world. The journey had been hard, brutal even, but it had led her here, to this man, this land, this life, and that made every hardship worth it. 6 months later, spring arrived with a violence of green growth and rushing water. The drought had finally broken. The rains came transforming the prairie from brown to emerald almost overnight. Ethan's herd had recovered to nearly 200 head. The ranch was thriving again. Not just surviving, but actually profitable for the first time in years. Grace's clinic was busier than ever. The old schoolhouse had been transformed into a proper medical facility, complete with examination table, shelves of medicines, and a small library of medical texts Dr. Hayes had given her. She saw patients 6 days a week treating everything from minor cuts to serious illnesses. Dr. Hayes continued his visits, teaching and mentoring. He had declared Grace the best student he had ever had and had begun advocating for the territorial government to create a special license for healers like Grace, who had training but not formal medical degrees. Mrs. Brennan had moved away. Not far, just to a small house on the edge of the next town over. Grace heard she had started a garden that she kept to herself, that she seemed at peace with her exile. Grace did not wish her ill. She understood now that Mrs. Brennan had been as much a victim of circumstances as an architect of cruelty. A woman broken by the world's judgment, trying desperately to maintain control in the only way she knew how. Sometimes the damaged hurt others not from malice, but from pain. Understanding that did not excuse the harm, but it made forgiveness possible. Frank Dalton had given up trying to buy the ranch. His own son had fallen ill with pneumonia during the winter, and Grace had saved him. The experience had humbled Dalton in ways nothing else could. He no longer spoke against Grace and had even publicly thanked her. Pastor Bennett kept his distance but continued to support the clinic quietly. He donated money, spread word of Grace's competence, defended her when anyone questioned her methods. He would never be her father, but he was keeping his promise to stand up for what was right. And Jake Miller had finally worked up the courage to court Emma Carter properly. They were not married yet, but everyone knew it was only a matter of time. On a warm afternoon in May, Grace stood in the clinic organizing supplies when Ethan appeared in the doorway. He had been working on the north fence and his shirt was dusty, his face streaked with sweat, but he was smiling. "Come outside," he said. "There's something you need to see." Grace followed him out to find a line of wagons approaching. Not just 1 or 2, but 8, maybe 9, filled with families. Men, women, children. More people than she had ever seen come to the clinic at once. "What's this?" she asked. "Word spread," Ethan said, "about the healer in Redemption Springs who actually helps people. These families traveled from 50 miles away, some even farther. They need you, Grace." Grace looked at the approaching wagons, at the hope and desperation on the faces of the people who had come seeking her help. And she felt something settle deep in her bones. Not fear or doubt, but certainty. This was her calling, her purpose, the reason she had survived when so many others had not. She had started as an apple thief, desperate and alone, had become a ranch hand, then a healer. And now she was something more, a symbol of possibility, proof that women could be more than wives and mothers, that skill and determination could overcome prejudice, that one person standing firm could change a community. "Well," she said, rolling up her sleeves, "I guess I'd better get to work." Ethan kissed her forehead. "I'll be here when you need me." "I know." And that was the miracle, that she had someone to stand beside her, not to save her or protect her or speak for her, but simply to be there, to share the burden, to celebrate the victories. As the first wagon pulled up and a woman climbed down with a sick child in her arms, Grace stepped forward, ready, capable, certain. The barefoot girl who had stolen an apple had become a woman who saved lives, and this was only the beginning.